Starting recording. All right. Hi, y'all. I am here with James Durson. He is a journalist who lives and works in Hong Kong, and I found out about him because I subscribe to his Pitch Whiz emails, which everyone who's interested in writing can subscribe to. Hi, James.
Hello. Good day.
Good day. Good day. Thanks for talking to me. Before I start asking you about the current pandemic and everything that's going on, I'd just like you to briefly tell me about your career as a journalist and where you're from and what brought you to work in Hong Kong.
Sure. Okay. Well, it's going back more than 20 years now. I think when I first started as a journalist in London, working for a small finance magazine published by Euromoney. I mean, I didn't have any kind of training. I actually studied psychology at university, but I always kind of had journalism in the back of my mind because I enjoyed writing, especially creative writing, which is a terrible reason to get into journalism.
That's my degree.
I fell into this area of thinking, right, what do I do with this kind of this love for writing and this talent for writing, as you know, all my teachers were telling me, and like I say, journalism is not really the answer, but that was the road I went down. And did a few years in London for a finance magazine, left to go traveling for around 6 months around Asia, went back to the UK to do some kind of food, edit some food titles, eventually left the UK about 13 years ago to go to India.
Oh, wow.
Which is when I first started freelancing on a proper full-time basis, essentially. And if anybody's thinking of doing some freelance writing, I fell into it by accident, but it was a great way to start because India, everyone speaks, or most people speak English, so I wasn't struggling to kind of converse with people who might be of interest for stories. But it's also very, very cheap to live there. So it meant that I wasn't under a huge amount of pressure every week, every day to be pumping out loads of stories just to make a living, just to kind of meet the bills and that sort of thing. So it allowed me the luxury of starting to explore travel writing and that sort of thing, which is how I started to go down the travel writing route. I did that for about 1.5 years out of Delhi. Then I got a full-time job in Mumbai, launching a bunch of magazines. And after that, I came to Hong Kong for 10 years.
Oh, just a minute, James. Sorry, your voice is up. Go ahead. I lost your sound for a second. You came to Hong Kong 10 years ago?
Yeah. So that was this job with CNN. So obviously I used some of the travel writing experiences I'd built up as a result of being in a cheap place, speaking English. And CNN, this was back, 11 years ago when they were just launching a product called CNN Go. It was the first time CNN was really trying to go for kind of lifestyle travel, that sort of content in Asia. And I was on board to help launch that CNN Go site, which eventually became CNN Travel. And so, I mean, that was it. I mean, and since then I've jumped into a couple of other jobs.
Yeah.
Now working in a wine bar, doing kind of the managing editor role for a wine critic here in Hong Kong. But I do a little bit of freelancing on the side. I've since launched Pitch Whiz, as you said. I've launched a blog called Travel Write Earn to help other wannabe travel writers, particularly focused on the pitch, how you actually pitch a story idea to editors that will intrigue them enough to at least reply to you, even if they don't buy it. And so that's where I am now, basically. So it's been lots of different morsels that I've been biting on through my career, and nothing that heavy. You know, I've never quite got into the kind of investigative, hard-hitting politics and that sort of thing. It's always been fairly light journalism, I would say. And these days, I even feel a little bit guilty calling myself a journalist at all, because it's much more of a kind of a managing role that I do, and delegating tasks, and you know, the reporters are the other people that are going out and doing the hard work, and I'm just kind of guiding them through it, essentially. But yeah, that's my background.
Okay. Very cool. Very cool. And you are, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but you're on an island right outside of Hong Kong, which I think is particularly interesting because we're in the midst of a pandemic. But I'll jump into that. So you've been in Hong Kong for a while. Obviously, we have been talking extensively about China and Wuhan and everything. I'm very curious because you were on the mainland. Even using these terms makes me nervous because different people have different definitions of Hong Kong and China. But please tell me about how you became aware of COVID-19 and what the Hong Kong reaction was like and what's happening there now. Yeah.
Yeah, God, I was trying to remember when I actually became aware of it. It's one of these things that it's grown and grown. You kind of forget that first instance. It must have been 3 or 4 months ago, essentially, when it all started kicking off. And I think Hong Kong was one of the first, probably, main developed cities to actually become scrutinized as a result, because we're so close. And Wuhan is, not a very close flight away. So I can't actually remember how I became aware, but it just started hitting the headlines. People started becoming more and more aware of it, talking about it. And particularly here, you started to see people take those social distancing precautions, wearing face masks. The shops and shopping malls here all left their doors open, so you wouldn't have to touch the door handles and that sort of thing. People will be pushing elevator buttons with either elbows or bits of tissue. So there were small differences like that. But in truth, I think we've actually been led off quite lightly compared to other places that have actually been in lockdown. We've never had an official lockdown here.
Wow.
Do not leave your home. Obviously, people now traveling into Hong Kong need to have the 2-week quarantine.
Yes.
But for people who have been here throughout this period, we've been able to go about our daily lives pretty much as normal. And particularly where I live, which is an island called Lamma, it's still in Hong Kong, but it's not the main Hong Kong island, and you have to get there by boat. And we've been a little bit kind of one step apart from the real chaos that has hit the city. And we noticed this with the protests, back in 2014 and then last year as well. Llama's kind of a little secluded bubble that tends not to be as affected. Obviously, I do notice it. I'm sitting here in the middle of kind of downtown Hong Kong, the Soho area, where all the bars and restaurants are. And you do see it when you come to the downtown here. But like I say, I think we've gotten off pretty lightly. We've only had 4 deaths, as far as I can remember, during this whole
Wow.
I can't remember how many actual confirmed cases, but compared to the States and the UK and many other countries, considering how close we are to China, that seems to be a very, that's a very good result, essentially.
So I guess, do you reckon that's just because they stopped the quarantine? I think that's what Australia has done as well, and that is massive, just forcing everyone to quarantine that arrives. Maybe that's the secret.
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think that kind of what you might call the face mask culture here.
Yes, yeah, true.
Here, even before the pandemic. This has been going on for many years in Hong Kong and other places around Asia, where if you're sick, you will wear a face mask so as not to infect your office colleagues, your family, whatever. It's kind of just part of the culture here. So I think the fact that everyone took that seriously, and literally you could not see a bare face,
right,
at least until a couple of weeks ago. Things have started to relax a bit now, but literally everybody would be wearing a face mask, not touching things, doing the elbow bump instead of shaking hands, stuff. So the kind of the citizenry here takes that sort of thing seriously. They will do what they're told, essentially, if these kind of policies and procedures get described by the authorities. So I think that's had a big part to do with it as well.
Right.
And
interesting,
of course. So yeah, it's hard to really define exactly why we've kind of gotten away, but it's interesting.
Yeah. And has your life personally and professionally, either on the island or with your work and everything, have you felt, has your life changed since the pandemic hit?
Only in a very small way, I guess. I think the main change for us has been, I have 2 kids. We have a daughter and a son, and my daughter, she just turned 6, so she's going to primary school, and the school's closed, and my son was in kindergarten. So the closure of the schools, I think, has been the main difference for us, with the kids just being at home all the time now.
Right. Right.
Apart
So they
from
did
that,
close. They did close schools as well. So they didn't go in lockdown, but they closed schools.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. So part of social distancing measures. So yeah, and the schools actually, some of them opened up about a month ago or 3 weeks ago maybe, but only on a 50% occupancy basis. So she's going every other day. So that's been the main thing for us, I think, just trying to entertain kids at home. Luckily for us, there's a kind of a domestic helper here as well, where you essentially have a nanny, and so all the domestic helpers gather the kids up on Lamma, and they go around and do kind of their own play groups, or they go to the beach. My kids have just become a pair of beach bums for the last 3 months, essentially, just going down to the beach pretty much every day.
Well, I would imagine that it's kind of like everyone on the island. It is a small island, isn't it? Like, how many people is it?
I mean, it's not tiny, but you can hike across it in 5 or 6 hours, maybe.
Right.
I think population is 5 or 6 or 7,000.
Okay.
Huge, but it's not minute. But yeah, and actually Lamma itself has had 0 confirmed cases of.
So it's kind of, that's what I was wondering. Can everyone kind of do, has the island itself, like, you can't go to school, but are people still going to cafes and, like, going about their business, but in masks? Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I know that the main difference has been some of the restaurants and cafes have requested people wear masks when they enter, and there's hand sanitizer about and that sort of thing. But you wouldn't notice a huge deal of difference, to be honest, on Lamma itself.
Right.
Like I say, even in downtown Hong Kong, the streets have never been abandoned. There's always people going about. There's always traffic on roads. So it's it hasn't been life as normal. The economy's been hit significantly, particularly for bars and restaurants and hotels, sort of stuff, tourism and travel. If you're just out in the city, out in the town, it's still pretty lively.
Okay. So, Interesting. And and this is a little bit of a surprise question, but as you mentioned, you're from the UK originally. Have you known anyone either in Hong Kong or back home that has actually had COVID-19?
No. Okay. Personally, a friend of mine, his dad died a few weeks ago. His dad was 90 plus years old. So that's about the closest I've come to think, and I'm half the world away from him, because he's in the UK and I'm here. It's unusually distant considering how global it's been and how it's been every day. We've been lucky to kind of escape any direct contact.
It's been strange for me, because I have been feeling Australia has done so well, as I've mentioned, but my eyes are on the United States, and I have known several people now that have either had it or have lost people from it, and it seems like things are coming back to normal here, or similar to you. You haven't noticed a huge difference, but still, just because I work in the media, just very aware that it is a problem. But it seems the sun is shining and cafes are opening back up, so it's a bit surreal sometimes. I think.
I mean, just the huge kind of media deluge from this, really interesting for me, I think, and particularly when you see how it has impacted everybody across the world pretty much. And you kind of have to ask the question, like, what if the media did this with something like climate change?
I know.
The nuclear question, or whatever it might be, if it suddenly just became the topic that everyone was talking about because it was critical and urgent and important, would we be able to affect that kind of change on those other important issues as well? It's a hypothetical, because obviously the pandemic, coronavirus, has been so urgent. It's been literally kind of days and weeks that make a difference, whereas I think it's harder to kind of convince people of that about things like climate change, unfortunately. But it's been an interesting kind of case study for sure in terms
It
of how it
has.
can manipulate.
Yeah, I agree. And then also with, I'm going to ask you about this protest, but also suddenly the Black Lives Matter erupted in the United States and then spread around the world. And then it was almost the next big thing. And I think that's important and also an interesting aspect of just how things are changing so quickly. And I am curious because Hong Kong was having protests before the pandemic started, and I've tried to kind of keep up with it. It's pro-democracy is what people in Hong Kong are protesting for, and I'm just curious because I know that they were forced to kind of stop, I guess, when the pandemic hit. And I know you're on an island, but you're also still in the mainland. And what have your observations been around the protest there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there are conspiracy theories going about that the coronavirus was deliberately sent here by the Chinese government to get the protesters off the street.
Oh, I hadn't heard that one.
There are lots of crazy ideas from the conspiracy world.
Yeah.
But yeah, for sure. I mean, suddenly, we'd had basically 12 months of pretty serious protests up until the start of this year. And the coronavirus hit, everybody got driven off the streets because of crowding and social distancing stuff. But now, I mean, already 2 weeks ago they've started the protests again. As soon as things started to calm down, the protesters were back out. I mean, it feels like Hong Kong just hasn't been out of the headlines for a good year and a half.
Yeah.
It's pretty tumultuous. I mean, just to clarify, the protests are actually about specific laws that China wants to bring into Hong Kong, essentially. So first of all, it was about protesting an extradition bill that would mean Hong Kong criminals, if you were arrested, you could be sent to China to face trial, which people were very worried about. The most recent one has been this security bill, which is you're not allowed to, sedition, secession, and subversion, or whatever. There's 3 or 4 words they've kind of focused on that you're not allowed to do now, and it's all about disrupting the party line and criticizing the Communist Party. And people are very upset about that because obviously China's record for kind of free speech and that sort of thing is pretty dire. So people are concerned. I mean, the interesting thing about that is that back in 1997, when Hong Kong was handed over from the British to China, there was actually what was laid out was what was called basic law, that in this basic law period, it would be 1 country, 2 systems. But a security bill that has just been suggested was actually suggested back then. It was meant to be part of the law package, but they couldn't get it through the main government here in Hong Kong or the Legislative Council. And so it never went ahead. But now I think, having seen how disruptive the protests were last year, China's keen to get this into action now, basically. But it's still very unpopular, which is why people are protesting against it. But yeah, it's kind of been a double whammy for the economy, especially, with protests disrupting things and then the coronavirus. So I think people I was going to say people are waiting to get back to normal, but I think people have almost forgotten what normal looks like here.
Well, that's interesting. This is a little bit of a surprise question, but do you find, just mentioning just the kind of the free speech and getting news and stuff like that, do you find it sometimes hard to know what's going on because of censorship at all? Do you feel like there's a few good news sources that you can trust, or?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's hard to know what's going on, but I think you asked as well about figures. Can we trust the figures?
Yes,
and that out of China? That is, I haven't studied it, and I don't know. And had I been writing a story about this, I might have been I'd have gone to a few sources who would have more informed opinions than me. It's very hard to know. I know that China has a track record of not being particularly accurate, let's say, when it kind of divulges these figures. But it's impossible for me to know, just as a guy who's reading the paper like everybody, without access to hospital data and all that sort of stuff, whether they're inaccurate or not.
Yeah.
Part of me thinks it doesn't really matter all that much, in the sense that, I mean, it might matter if there's a tenfold difference, right? If China said there are 50,000 cases and actually there are 500,000, then you're talking significant, because that's something the world needs to listen to, and they need to know how the rest of the world might get affected. But if they've reduced it from like 80,000 to 50,000, does that make much? It doesn't, maybe it does statistically, and if you're a statistician, you're probably going to me right now and say, yes, that makes a huge difference, that's a 40% difference, and blah blah blah. It could be big, but the point is, it's very difficult to know. Anyway, just sitting here, what's accurate or not. I think what can't be argued is that things needed to happen to stop the pandemic, and we did. The Hong Kong did pretty much what it needed to do, so that's why I guess we've seen so few deaths, if you can trust that figure.
Yeah. So. Well, yeah. I mean, that's interesting what you're saying. There's a quote, I should know who said it, but it's journalism is a rough draft of history. And I really like that, because, things will be wrong, and we need different, you raise a good point about the numbers. So that my question was more about the numbers of deaths and cases, and also for sure that it has originated where people say that it originated, because there's a lot of different things coming out there. But I do think that that's why we need journalism, is because we these things will slowly evolve, and when good people are on the case, then the answer slowly reveal itself. Maybe it's a little bit harder for that to happen in China, but I also think that we have the rest of the world watching as well. So.
Yeah. I mean, as in the case of, the source of it being this wet market in Wuhan, again, it's like the only alternatives I've seen have sounded very conspiracy theorist, being viruses, bred in a lab and then escaping or being deliberately let loose. Again, it's for me, it would just be guesswork. I have no idea the reality of any of that. You say, it's important that people in China are actually trying to investigate these things. And I mean, it raised an interesting question. The Chinese government must know whether it's the wet market in Wuhan or a lab, where the source was. And so they will be cracking down on making sure this sort of thing doesn't happen again, because it's hit the Chinese economy so massively. As long as that's happening, as long as they're being informed, that's the number one most important thing, in my view, that they're making sure this sort of thing does not multiply and repeat. I think that for the rest of us as citizens to know about it, yes, we need to be informed. It's important that we are informed, but that's almost secondary to that primary motivation, that primary effort to make sure that at least the scientists know where it's come from, and they crack down on making sure it doesn't happen, basically. I agree. Well, and I think, when we talk, if we chat this time next year, we'll know, we'll have so much more information. It's just a waiting game at the moment, but we've all, I mean, things have changed so fast, and we have learned things. This has been a crazy year in so many different ways. Do you, and you were talking about the economy being affected. I'm glad to hear that you still have work, and I'm guessing you do a lot of work from home, which is good. Have you seen any positive things? Have there been any silver linings? I mean, the silver linings for me is how we will approach regular life after this, I think. I think I'm going to be washing my hands a lot more before eating, sort of thing. Just being aware of how germs spread, essentially. We're all kind of cerebrally or intellectually aware of it before, but now we've seen, wow, it really can affect things. And I've noticed in myself, normally I get a lot of colds. I have 2 kids at home, a lot of people. Every couple of months I'm getting a cold or a flu-like thing. I've been absolutely healthy throughout this whole period.
Me too. It's crazy. Because I get sick every 2 months, and just
So that's an interesting lesson as well. Really small measures, a mask, washing your hands when you get home, trying not to touch too many public surfaces, whatever, just small little things like that that don't really impact your life deleteriously in any major way can help your health, and ostensibly therefore the health of your family and close friends and that sort of thing. So maybe one lining. I'm sure there are probably a couple of others, but I think we take lessons, right? And, and we don't just forget it, put it away in the cupboard. Oh, that's the coronavirus, done, and just move on and don't learn anything. That would be the worst outcome, really.
I think and probably we'll see it impacting and influencing culture in interesting ways for years to come, for sure. Thanks so much, James. Is there anything else you'd like to mention before I let you go?
I don't think so. I mean, you mentioned to me a little bit earlier about how it's been for you. How does my description of the pandemic here in Hong Kong differ to yours? And to get on with life as usual, or have you been fairly affected?
I have lost a few. I didn't even actually. I just took a little bit of a pay cut for one of the gigs that I was doing. But actually, since then, it has been rectified. So I've been quite lucky. But one interesting thing is just doing these interviews. I think actually I have felt very isolated. Maybe being on an island, you might be able to identify with this a little bit. Australia is a huge island, but my family's in the United States, and I have felt very isolated as I've watched everything happen, and I am here with everything going back to normal. And the best thing for me is that I've just started doing these interviews. Actually, I found that I'm not sure how I'm going to use them, but it has brought me a real odd sense of peace, because I get to hear, like, you see so many headlines in the media that are quite terrifying, and I think that they're important, but it's also really interesting to hear that that Hong Kong has done things quite well, hopefully, and that we're learning from this. But then also there are some scary things. I interviewed a doctor from Chicago last week, and that was quite intense, because he was saying, Australia's had 100 deaths, and he, as a doctor, has had 100 deaths. So it's, I don't know, I have found it an interesting, this moment in time has forced me, or has made me kind of and impulsively want to talk to different people to find out what's going on, because I have found a little bit disconnected, and I find that stories from individuals in some ways are much more reassuring or informative compared to just headlines.
I can see that. I mean, it's much easier to engage with the story and a person than it is a bunch of numbers, right?
Yes.
So, sure, I saw some of the previous interviews you've done. I'm looking forward to seeing what the end result is.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Well, I appreciate that. Hopefully I'll do something with it. I hope so. Cool. James, thanks so much for your time, and I will be in touch.
Great.